It's time for us to check back in with Dorie, Woman of the Mountains, and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous recordings, just look in the description below for a playlist. In August, we found we were going to have a baby. I love children, and nothing could have made me happier. The Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward catalogs had pages of beautiful baby clothes. I spent hours looking at them and planning the things we would buy. Our baby was going to have fine, store-bought clothes, not the flannel clothing like Ma had for us. Fred said I could order a complete layette, dresses, gowns, diapers, everything. And as I grew larger in the middle, my dresses grew tighter. Ma helped me make bigger dresses and large bibbed aprons to wear over them. Pregnant women were taught not to flaunt their condition. In fact, people seemed embarrassed and uncomfortable in the presence of a bulgy lady. The apron hid my condition nicely. Summer was pushed aside by the cool, foggy fall weather. Some mornings the mist would be so heavy I couldn't see Ma and Pa's house in front of us. The days grew shorter and Fred's work hours were finished in the dark. Usually I could watch him coming up the railroad with his short legs stepping over 2 cross ties at a time, but now he brought the dark night air in with him. He'd always been teased about his walk. I thought it was a jaunty, conceited stride, but the boarders teased him. "Fred, you walk like a duck in a hurry," they'd say. I didn't like it, but he laughed with them. One night after the table was cleared, we filled out the order blanks for the baby clothes. Some things came from Sears and some from Montgomery Ward's. Everything had to be perfect, so we took the best from both. Fred mailed the letter in Elkmont. The mail was terribly slow, and our orders had to go all the way to Chicago. We waited and waited for our packages. I was sure the baby would arrive before its clothing came. Ma had never told me what to expect when the baby came. When the labor pains started, I didn't know what was wrong with me. As the pains grew in their intensity, I walked and walked around the room. Fred knew no more about birth than I. He went to get Ma to come and see what was wrong with me. She said the baby was coming. Just to be sure she was right, she gave me a cup of beadwood tea to drink. It was a painkiller of sorts. If my pains continued, I was in labor. They continued. The company doctor, Bruce Montgomery, had an office in Elkmont. There was no way to fetch him without going to his office. Fred took the hand pump car that belonged to the railroad and usually sat off the track near Pa's. The pump car could coast down the tracks to Elkmont, but Fred and the doctor would have to walk back up to our house. The tracks were too steep for them to bring the car back. By the time the doctor arrived, Ma and Linda Gray had everything ready. It was a new experience for Ma and Mrs. Gray to have a doctor delivering a baby. That was something one woman did for another in the mountains. Tuesday, April 27th, Wilma Catherine Cope was born. Ma wasn't impressed with Dr. Montgomery. He didn't do anything she couldn't have done. There were no pain-killing drugs. He just waited for nature to do its work. Ma took care of us while I was in bed. Women who had given birth were not allowed to stand on their feet for 9 days. Wilma was a beautiful and healthy baby. I had my own little live doll to play with and love. In 2 weeks, I would be 17 years old. Soon after, Pa and Ma moved to Three Forks and lived in the bookkeeper's house. It was much better housing, and the company did all the work involved in moving. They'd only been gone a week or two when Fred said we were going to Three Forks too. The company rewarded their better workers with better living quarters. Fred was a good, dependable worker, and as his reward, we moved into a movable railroad car furnished like a house inside. It had a coal-burning heater with the company furnishing all the coal. There were 4 windows with pretty curtains already hung. The curtains had horses stenciled on them. I thought they were beautiful and useful. Most mountain homes never had curtains because windows were small and set high in the wall. There were 3 types of company portable housing. They varied in size and in the number of windows and doors in each unit. Since all portable units had to be moved on railroad flat cars, the structure couldn't be longer than 12 to 14 feet and wider than 8 feet. Each had a hole in the top and bottom, covered with tin that could be removed, leaving a place for a heavy chain and hook to be dropped through the middle of the unit and lifted aboard the railroad car. All of the units were built at the company sawmill in Townsend and brought to the various camps up the side of the mountains. They were known as box cars, cracker boxes, and shotgun houses. The shotgun houses were scattered like buckshot from a gun blast, dotting the side of the mountain. Both the inside and outside of the units were made from rough lumber. Tar paper was used as an insulation between the walls. Linoleum covered the splintery wood floors. Most of the units were painted barn red and almost blood-colored, chalky paint that chipped off easily. The slightly slanted tar paper roof didn't fit tightly to the walls, leaving a small crack where snow sifted through in the wintry wind blast constantly hitting the mountains. When we got up in the morning, the floor and beds would be covered with silky snow. The dust from the 1935 Kansas dust storm blew through and left part of the Kansas wheat fields in our food, hair, and clothes. During the dust storms, the sun over the Smoky Mountains was seen as a red ball slowly moving between the lofty peaks. When the house had to be moved, the stove and other household furniture were packed and taken out. After everything was ready, the tin covers were removed, and the heavy chain and hook were dropped down from the ceiling through the floor to steel crossbars that made an X just under the hole in the floor. The hook was fastened to the bars, and a crane lifted the unit and put it on a flat car. The household goods were placed back into the house after it was loaded on the flat car. The walls usually had lots of shelves for storage because there was no room for chests or dressers. The place where the house sat was called a house seat. It was a pallet-like structure made from poles, which was dismantled and moved to the next site to be used again. House seats were not always used. Sometimes the flat cars would be pulled out on a short span of railroad and left with the housing units still on board. When this happened, we could be sure the job in that area wouldn't last long. If the logging operation was to be long-term, 2 or 3 units were placed together to accommodate large families or boarders. Doors were cut into the end so there would be one continuous living space. Fred was engineer on a skidder, working daylight to dark, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. There was no church to go to anyway. I played with Wilma and visited Ma in my spare time. On one of Fred's rare days off, we stayed in bed as long as Wilma would let us. I got up before Fred and started breakfast. Salt pork was soaking in a pan of boiling water to remove some of the salt before frying it. After putting the pork in a skillet, I poured the hot water out the open window. Avery Cogdell's bear dog was asleep under the window. When the water hit him, he howled so loudly, Mr. Cogdell come running to see what was wrong with his dog. The dog was going around in circles, yelping in pain. I felt terrible about the poor thing, but I wasn't going outside to see how badly he was hurt. Mr. Cogdell was roaring mad. He threatened to come in and thrash me. I was scared because he was said to be a fighting man, and next to his wife, he loved that bear dog more than anything. Hearing all the commotion, Fred got up and went outside. After a shouting match, they both decided to forget the whole thing. The dog's wounds healed, but Mr. Cogdell never felt kindly toward me. More luxuries were finding their way into the mountains. Ma bought a sewing machine. We copied dresses from the Sears and Ward catalogs. Our cloth came from the company store or by mail order. Ma no longer spent days spinning and weaving. The store had shelves of calico, gingham, lawn, and flannel on big bolts. Silk was kept inside a glass case for protection. There were chests full of spools filled with colorful thread, buttons by the pound, and pins and needles. Life had never been so easy for Ma. If one can say keeping house for several boarders is an easy life, at least some of her chores were lighter. Fred and I were at Three Forks for 3 months before we were told to move to El Dorado. The skidder he worked on was being sent to a new job between Cades Cove and Townsend. The El Dorado acreage was one of the largest holdings of the Little River Company. Out of the mountains we normally worked. It was so far removed that El Dorado is not part of the national park now. We were not happy there. The people seemed different. There were fewer than 5 women on the job, and the men were rougher in language and living. I was a nervous wreck from keeping a constant watch on Wilma, who was beginning to crawl and be into everything. My every move seemed to be watched by the timber cutting crews working close to the cabin. Fred's hunting dog, Jake, wasn't happy either. There was no time for hunting, and somebody was always telling him to get out of the way. The final straw was when Fred scolded him for eating food a neighbor had put out for his pigs. Old Jake couldn't take it any more. He left and went back home to Three Forks. He showed up at Ma and Pa's, lean and hungry. Ma wrote that he had come home. I was homesick too. I knew exactly how Jake must have felt. Fred agreed that Wilma and I would be happier back with the family. He spent the last 3 months in El Dorado by himself. El Dorado was named by a mountain man who had journeyed to the far west in search of gold. After not finding any there, he became convinced there was gold in the Smokies. He came back and created his own western town, El Dorado. It had a different feeling than the other places we lived. Maybe he did bring part of the Old West with him. The kind of gold he was looking for couldn't be found in our mountains. Most of life's true gold is missed by people who look down for shiny yellow pieces of metal instead of up at the golden beauty of a mountain sunset, the golden wildflowers, and the simple gold that forms on the churn dasher as cream turns into golden mounds of butter. Our job in El Dorado was over in 6 months, and there wouldn't be another one until early spring. Ma and Pa asked us to live with them until Fred could work again. The bookkeeper's house was big and warm. Ma still kept boarders so we could earn our keep by helping her with the work. Ma had kept Moonsie for me. He was thin and sad when I saw him again. Before going to Three Forks for the winter, we decided to go to Cramerton, North Carolina to see Fred's family. Wilma was less than a year old when she crossed the mountains for the first time. The train had a dining car but no sleepers. We would have to sit up all night in the passenger car. The conductor came down the aisle saying supper was being served in the dining car. The tables had red check cloths, snow-white dishes, and silverware. Beside each plate was a small crystal bowl filled with water. I didn't know what they were for, and Fred didn't either. While we waited for our food, Fred became thirsty. "I guess we're supposed to drink this," he said. He did. Later, we noticed other people dipping their fingers into the bowls and drying them on their napkins. Fred looked embarrassed. "They're finger bowls," he whispered. "I hope nobody saw me drink mine." The waiter noticed the empty bowl and gave Fred a sad, sorrowing look. We laughed about it when we were safely out of the dining car. "Live and learn," he laughed. We had a good time with the Copes. They spoiled Wilma dreadfully. Several members of the family were working in the mills, and money was no problem. In fact, they were doing so well that they begged us to stay and work. One of the greatest sadnesses of their lives was losing Fred to a Tennessee girl who had no intentions of leaving the mountains. We both wanted to return to the Smokies, so the pleading was in vain. After a week, we boarded the train to take us back to Three Forks. Three Forks was covered with several feet of snow when we got back. The lumber business was at a midwinter standstill. Pa and the boarders hunted and fished and exchanged tall tales while they waited for a break in the weather. Pa woke bright and cheerful one Sunday morning and challenged Fred to catch as many fish as he could. They were out all morning. At noon they came home with 18 fish. Fred had caught 15 and Pa had caught 3. Pa couldn't let him win, so he challenged him again. They were out until supper. Again, they brought in 18 fish. Fred had 15, and Pa had 3. Pa said it just hadn't been a good day to fish. There was a time when they caught 128 trout in 4 hours, enough for a meal for all the neighbors. Ma was surprised that time. She could outfish them both. The fish must have died from shock, she said. When all the trains and machinery were quiet, we could hear the sudden rumble of an approaching earthquake. We felt tremors all over the mountains. Just at supper time in 1916, a quake shook the house, jarring dishes off the shelves. The table danced around, bumping into us as we sat around it. As soon as we realized what was happening, we ran outside until the tremor was over. It only lasted a few minutes, but it seemed like hours. We stayed together in one room, expecting another quake to follow. Pa and Fred went to see if any of our neighbors had suffered damage. A man told Pa that Dr. Montgomery's office was in shambles. All the medicine stored on shelves was broken and scattered over the floor. Other than the fire on the mountain, earthquakes were most feared. Even with quakes and flash floods, we lost relatively few people. Minor train accidents were frequent, but we didn't hear of many deaths or severe injuries. Charles Badgett, superintendent of the Little River Lumber Company, invited his father to spend the day on the job with him. They were riding in the caboose with the train crew behind a long string of flat cars. The caboose broke loose and started back down the track. Mr. Badgett and his father jumped off the caboose. The elder Mr. Badgett was killed, along with Police Myers and Earl Dockery. All the crew had jumped from the runaway car except my Uncle John Hampton. He didn't get a scratch, while the others suffered severe cuts and bruises. The caboose went about a mile down the mountain and jumped the tracks going into the river. Uncle John walked back up the railroad. He said he knew the caboose would have to stop somewhere, and he'd just ride it out. Besides, he said, he was too scared to move, much less jump. In April of 1916, the Peawood Hollow job started. We moved back into our movable railroad car and went higher into the mountains. Pa and Ma stayed at Three Forks with the boarding house. The winter had been a mild one and spring arrived early. Everything was green and lush in Peawood Hollow. The mountains were straight up and down all around us. Certainly there would be no place for a garden, and the cow would have to be stabled up on the mountain. The only level places were beside the railroad, where our house would be sidetracked. Men had labored for months digging a bed for the tracks around the mountain. Our house would only be a few feet from the railroad. We were just stuck on the side of the mountain like bugs on flypaper. Just behind the house, the earth stopped and plunged into a deep hollow. The sides were straight up and down, seemingly without a bottom. Men struggled to get the logging equipment on the mountain. The train made many groaning, agonizing trips in front of our house. The skidder was pushed and pulled into place. I could hear the train's wheels spinning on the tracks as it strained to do its work. One evening, after we'd been there a few weeks, the dark mountain shadows were moving toward the house, and in the failing light, I saw a small animal coming up the railroad. Assuming it was a possum or raccoon, I thought no more about it until I heard scratching at the door. What is it? And is it mad with rabies? Were my thoughts. The scratching continued, and then I heard a gentle meow. Slightly opening the door enough to see what it was, I heard the meow again. Now I knew what it was. There stood Moonsie asking politely to come inside. Only God knew how he had found me. We were 16 miles away from where I'd left him with Ma. There were a mountain and a river between us. Had he followed a star to find his way as the early sailors had done to find their way across oceans? Thankful for whatever instinct that had urged him on, he was home, and I was overjoyed. To use Fred's words, he was razor soup thin and very tired. His sweet but somewhat goofy face gazed up at me, and loud rumbly purrs told us how happy he was to be home again. I'd never leave him with anyone else. Soon everything was running, and loads of logs rumbled by the house. The weight and movement of the trains jarred the earth. Dishes rattled and sometimes tumbled to the floor. Wilma had to be watched constantly. The trains and the deep hollow made this a dangerous place for a child. She had to stay inside unless I was with her. We hadn't been there long when a log train, going past with a loader full of logs, fell over directly in front of our house. It barely missed the house and fell over the side of the mountain. The whole thing was over before I realized what had happened. I heard the metallic, squeaky noise of the train, the thunderous boom of the logs hitting the ground, and then silence as they fell into the hollow. Loaders are equipped with boilers of their own to produce power. Looking out the door, I saw the loader lying on its side with hot white steam hissing. Thinking it would explode any minute, I grabbed Wilma and ran up the tracks away from the wreck. The crew met me on their way down. They said there wasn't any danger of explosion and I could stay in the house. Wilma, sensing my terror, was screaming at the top of her voice. 2 cranes were brought up from Elkmont to pull the loader back on the tracks. A few more feet and it would have been in the deep hollow with the logs. Fred still worked the dawn to dusk shift while I took care of things at home. We had 4 boarders who had to be fed morning and night and have lunches packed for the job. I had to carry water from a spring about a half a mile away for all our drinking, cooking, and washing. Once a week I made out a grocery list and sent it out on the train to the company store. After all the men were gone, Wilma and I were free to do what we wanted. Morning and evening we climbed the mountain to milk the cow. She grazed around the house and up the mountain, always returning to her stall for milking time. She waited in the stall until we came to milk. One morning she wasn't anywhere to be seen. Calling and looking, we went around the mountain. Wilma pointed down to the hollow below. The cow never went there, so I kept calling. "Mama," Wilma said, "she's down there." I looked down. The cow was there all right, dead. She had fallen off the mountain and broken her neck. The death of our cow was a great loss, and I didn't know how we would replace her. I thought of the jokes Pa and Ma used to make about falling out of the cornfield. What would they say about our cow falling out of her pasture? So another great, interesting peek into Dorie's life. Dorie, Fred, and now Wilma. They're in the logging camps in the Smoky Mountains. Just some amazing things that they seen. So many things in this little part of the book that jumped out at me. I would like to know what the beadwood tea that the mother give Dorie as a natural painkiller. If you know what that is, please share that information. I've never heard of that before. I've of course read it in the book, but I don't know what that is. So I really like that part. I do think it's funny, again, Dorie's mother, she's kind of the person that knows how to do everything and is so the strength of the family, but then she didn't even tell Dorie what to expect when she was having labor pains. So I thought that was kind of comical that her and Fred didn't know what was wrong with her, and they had to go get her mother, and then she said, "Well, you're in labor." So I thought that was really interesting. The portable housing was very interesting. I can't imagine living in a cart like that, where they could pick it up and move it. That was really interesting, especially the ones they connected, so then you could go through them. And especially there at the end when Dorie's living in the one that's just right by the railroad, I would have been so nervous the whole time, afraid the train would hit me, afraid, especially after the accident that happened. I would have been terrified to have lived in that little home. But it sounds like Dorie made it pretty good. It's interesting, even though they lived back there in the Smoky Mountains then and in that remote area, the things that they were exposed to, like the finger bowls that Fred drank out of. I might have made that mistake too. I wouldn't have known what that was. But you can begin to see the change in society, and she kind of alludes to that when she's talking about her mother having an easier life. So even though she was in such a remote area, Dorie and Fred could order from the catalog so they could get material, the baby clothes and different things like that. And even her mother could go to the store now and buy the cloth that she had always made. So I know that made their lives easier, just like so many things make our lives easier. But there's always a part of you that thinks, but what did they give up by not being able to do those things for themselves? Of course, they still could. But we've got so far away from those, like the weaving and the being self-sufficient like that, so many things. I wonder sometimes. But then again, you think of the flip side of it. Whoever was making the clothes at the factories that Sears or Montgomery Ward had, they needed jobs. So that's just one of those deep things you think about, or I do anyway. What have we lost? But then certainly, I love my modern amenities too. I love being able to order things like that. So that's just something that sometimes I ponder about. I worry, though, that maybe we've lost too much if we ever had to go back to that time, I guess is what it is. I would have loved to have seen the places, though, that Dorie was at, especially that last place that was so steep that the cow literally fell off the mountain. you hear people talk about mountains being steep as mules' faces around here, so that one was certainly that steep, if not even steeper. So I would have loved to have seen those beautiful places. And then the sad part about the cow is terribly sad, both that the cow fell off, but also for Dorie and Fred that they lost their source of milk. But how precious that Moonsie and the dog, the bear dog or the hound dog, whatever it was, that they found their way home. They had enough of wherever they was at, and the dog went back home to her pa and mother's, but then Moonsie found Dorie. That's just an amazing, the animals can become that close and attached to us humans, and that they want to be back with the people that they know will take care of them. So that's just a really sweet part of the story, that Moonsie made it all the way back. But I hope you enjoyed this part of the book as much as I did. Oh, and one more thing I was going to say. I love the part about where she says, when the man that went all the way out west to find gold, and then come back and he named that area El Dorado. But I loved the little lines that she used to say that sometimes, what she was saying, like, for example, he was looking for gold, always looking down, looking for those gold nuggets, but then he missed all those simple things of gold, from the butter to the mountains, to the beauty of the flowers, to all those kind of things. I really loved that. I really try my best, I don't always, but I try my best to live my life like that, to look for those little things that are just all around us, but are gold, just like she said, they're golden. That's the best way to sum it up. And that's a wonderful way to live your life, looking for those little pieces of gold, not in the monetary sense, but in those, whether it's a flower or a beautiful mountain, or the smile of a child or an old person or whatever. All those things are just wonderful. So please leave a comment and let me know what you enjoyed in this part of the book. And as always, I hope you'll come back next Friday, because we've got to see what happens to now Dorie, Fred, and Wilma next in Dorie, Woman of the Mountains.